The story begins in the late 1990s in Charlotte, North Carolina, where a man named David Gant worked as a vault supervisor at Loomis Fargo and Company. He was an ordinary guy, stuck in a job that didn't pay well, living a life that felt mundane. Every day, he handled millions of dollars, stacking bills, locking them away, and watching them get transported to different banks. The irony: none of it was his. It was just part of his job. But that started to change. A former co-worker, Kelly Campbell. Kelly was someone David had always had a soft spot for. She was charming, fun, and had a way of making him feel important. After she left Loomis Fargo, they kept in touch. During one of their conversations, Kelly mentioned an idea, a way to change their lives forever. She knew David wasn't happy with his job. She also knew he had access to the money. What if, just once, he took some, not a little, a lot, enough to disappear, to start fresh somewhere else? At first, David laughed it off. He wasn't a criminal. He had never stolen anything in his life. But the more Kelly talked about it, the more tempting it became. She introduced him to a man named Steve Chambers, a guy with big dreams, but not a lot of patience. Steve convinced David that pulling off the heist would be easy. All he had to do was walk out of the vault with the cash. They had it all planned out. David would take the money, flee to Mexico, and lay low while things cooled down. Once the heat was off, they'd divide the money and live the rest of their lives in luxury. The plan seemed foolproof. David had the access. The vault was familiar territory. He knew the security systems, the schedules, the weak points. It was just a matter of timing. And the timing, as it turned out, couldn't have been more perfect. On the night of October 4th, 1997, David Gant went to work as usual. He wasn't nervous, at least, that's what he told himself. He had rehearsed every move in his head over and over again. It had to be smooth, no hesitation, no mistakes. He waited until the right moment, when he was alone in the vault. The security cameras were rolling, but he knew that wouldn't be a problem. The plan was already in motion. He started loading cash into a company van. Not just a few stacks, millions of dollars. Bundles of bills, stuffed into duffel bags, one after another. The weight of it all was staggering. At one point, he had stopped to catch his breath. This was more money than he had ever seen in his life. And it was all about to be his. When the van was full, he climbed in and drove away. Just like that. No alarms, no sirens, no one chasing after him. It almost felt too easy. He kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see flashing lights, but the streets were empty. The city was quiet. It felt surreal. He had just pulled off a multimillion-dollar heist, and no one even knew yet. He drove to a meeting point where Steve Chambers and the rest of the crew were waiting. They quickly unloaded the cash and transferred most of it into another vehicle. The plan was working. David was supposed to take a smaller portion and head straight to Mexico, where he'd wait for the situation to settle down. Everything was going exactly as they had planned. But what David didn't know was that this was just the beginning. The real problems were about to start. David Gant had done his part. The money was out. He was in Mexico, living what should have been his dream life. But almost immediately, things started going wrong. The people he trusted, Steve Chambers, Kelly Campbell, and the rest of the crew, weren't following the plan as smoothly as he had expected. Instead of keeping a low profile, they were making some of the dumbest mistakes imaginable. Steve Chambers, the so-called mastermind behind the operation, wasted no time flaunting his sudden wealth. Instead of lying low, he moved his family into a mansion in one of the most expensive neighborhoods in North Carolina. He went from living paycheck to suddenly throwing money around like he had won the lottery. He paid off all his debts in cash, bought a $635,000 home, and stuffed it with expensive furniture and artwork. He even hired a personal security guard, a strange move for someone who was supposed to be keeping a low profile. Then there was his wife, Michelle. She wasn't exactly discreet either. She started shopping like there was no tomorrow, walking into banks with large wads of cash to make deposits. She once handed a bank teller so much money that they had to file a report. When asked where the money came from, she casually said, "We won the lottery." Not just once, multiple times. It didn't take long for people to start asking questions. Back in Mexico, David was starting to feel uneasy. He had taken about $25,000 with him, enough to get by while waiting for his share of the millions. But something wasn't right. The money he was promised wasn't arriving. The calls from Kelly and Steve were becoming less frequent. The plan was falling apart, and he was stuck in a foreign country with no real way to fix it. Meanwhile, the FBI was already onto them. At first, the heist had seemed like a well-executed inside job. But as the investigators dug deeper, they started noticing the trail of stupidity left behind by Steve and his crew. The excessive spending, the sudden lifestyle changes, the obvious lies. It was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. One of the biggest mistakes came from Steve himself. Paranoid that David might get caught and talk, he started discussing ways to get rid of him. He wasn't subtle about it either. He made a phone call to a hitman, offering money to take David out before he could expose the entire operation. But what he didn't know was that law enforcement was already listening. As the FBI connected the dots, they closed in on Steve, Michelle, Kelly, and the rest of the gang. They weren't dealing with criminal masterminds. They were dealing with amateurs who had no idea how to stay under the radar. David, still in Mexico, finally realized that he had been betrayed. The people he trusted had cut him off, leaving him stranded while they enjoyed the money he had risked everything for. He knew he had to act fast, and what happened next would be the final nail in the coffin for America's dumbest criminals. The walls were closing in. David Gant, once convinced he was part of a perfect crime, now saw the truth. He had been left behind. Stranded in Mexico with barely enough cash to survive, he had no idea that back in the U.S., his so-called partners were digging their own graves. The FBI was piecing everything together, and it was only a matter of time before the whole operation came crashing down. Steve Chambers, the self-proclaimed criminal genius, had started to panic. His paranoia was growing by the day. He knew the FBI had to be closing in, and in his mind, there was only one way to ensure his safety: eliminate David. He couldn't risk Gant getting caught and talking. But Steve, in his usual reckless style, didn't handle it quietly. Instead, he hired a hitman. Or at least, that's what he thought he was doing. Steve had been bragging about his money and power, believing he could fix any problem with cash. So when he decided to put a hit out on David, he made a call. But what he didn't know was that the FBI was already monitoring him. Every word was being recorded. Every move was being watched. He wasn't just exposing his crimes. He was handing over evidence on a silver platter. Meanwhile, David was getting desperate. He had trusted Kelly to keep him updated, to make sure he got his share of the money. But she had gone silent. No more phone calls. No more promises. Nothing. That's when he realized something chilling. He wasn't just being ignored. He was being set up to disappear. The FBI, already aware of Steve's reckless spending, had now uncovered his plans to get rid of David. They had enough evidence to act. But they wanted to get everything. Every person involved. Every last dollar. And that meant letting things play out just a little longer. Back in North Carolina, Steve and his wife, Michelle, were acting like they had gotten away with the biggest heist in history. They were throwing lavish parties, bragging about their newfound wealth, and surrounding themselves with people who had no idea the money they were spending had come straight from a Loomis Fargo vault. But cracks were starting to show. Neighbors were whispering. Friends were asking questions. How did Steve, a guy who had never been particularly successful, suddenly become a millionaire overnight? And why did he act so nervous whenever the police were around? The FBI was closing in, and the evidence was overwhelming. They had surveillance footage of David loading the money. They had Steve's phone calls about the hitman. They had bank records showing ridiculous deposits of cash. And most importantly, they had people who were starting to talk. One by one, the crew began to crack under pressure. Kelly, realizing she was in over her head, started cooperating with the authorities. She confessed her role in the plan, detailing how the heist had been planned and how Steve had taken control of the money. That was all the FBI needed. The arrests came quickly. Steve was taken into custody first, caught completely off guard. Michelle wasn't far behind. The rest of the crew followed. And then there was David. The FBI tracked him down in Mexico, where he was barely getting by. But instead of the hitman Steve had promised, it was federal agents who showed up. David, exhausted, betrayed, and completely broke, didn't even resist. He knew it was over. One of the largest cash heists in American history had ended in one of the most ridiculous ways possible. The thieves had been their own worst enemies, their greed and stupidity turning them into walking targets. And just like that, the unperfect crime was finally over. In the end, what was supposed to be the perfect crime became one of the dumbest heists in American history. David Gant, Steve Chambers, Kelly Campbell, and the rest of the crew had all dreamed of a life filled with luxury, but their greed, mistakes, and sheer lack of common sense led them straight into the hands of the FBI. David was sentenced to over 7 years in prison, while Steve, Kelly, and the others received their own punishments. The money. Most of it was recovered, though some of it was never found. But one thing was clear: these criminals weren't masterminds. They were amateurs who thought they could outsmart the system, only to become the punchline of one of the most ridiculous crime stories in history. If you enjoyed this crazy true crime story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable stories. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Let us know in the comments. What do you think was the dumbest mistake they made? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.